Throughout the length of my project, I've made a couple of adjustments to my overall project plan, which are reflected here in my roadmap. Firstly, thanks to some feedback from Gavin and Connor, I have decided to focus my project on two main things. First is how much a team should be spending on each position, and second is a basic analysis of the question of is it good to have a couple of really high paid players or more medium paid players, things like that. For that, the time frame has been adjusted. Data collection ultimately took longer than I anticipated, and so more time was allocated for that. I've done some preliminary data management and some analysis of the positional spending. I'm currently working on that analysis of total spending, and I will be finalizing the project in the next couple of weeks. The data I will talk about more on the next slide, and then the business applications and things like that largely stay the same. The goal of my project will be to help teams make the playoffs and make it further in the playoffs, which ultimately brings in more revenue. And the focus will be on teams kind of coming out of the rebuild. These are teams who have a lot of cap flexibility, so they're able to actually use my findings. For the data, there's two main sets of data. You've got the player data, which is just like the position and cap hit, things like games played. And then there's also the team data, which has things like how many points they got in the season. That's points is just like how you did in the standings, and then whether or not you made the playoffs and how far you made it in the playoffs. I'll also then be looking at like the total spending and the spending per position. This will be synthesized by the player data of all players in that team, and then moving it over into the team data into like one team number, things like that. And then I can also look at the spending per line. That's like how much you're spending for like your top 3 forwards or your top 6 forwards, things like that. For the statistical methodology, this is not necessarily exhaustive, but these are the things that I'm planning on focusing on. For applied probability, I'm going to be looking at the probability of a team making the playoffs given several different conditions. This is like if you're spending more per forward than per defenseman or more per goaltender than defenseman. I also want to look at if it's good for a team to have a highly paid backup goaltender, and so I can, if their backup goaltender is making more than the league minimum, how does that affect your probability of making the playoffs? And then I can also look at if you have like multiple really high paid players, 10 million is often the commonly used cutoff for that, how does that affect your probability? For the statistical inference, I can use the fact that the goal is to be making the playoffs and to be making it further in the playoffs to then try and determine how much revenue a team will be making from those playoff games. And so I can figure out things like the probability of a team making over $10 million in additional revenue given some of my findings. For hypothesis testing, I will be comparing the positional spending, things like that, trying to determine if things from the applied probability are actually like give significant change that is worth taking note of. And then for regression, I'll be using two main types of regression. I'll be using logistic regression in the regular season to predict whether or not a team makes the playoffs, and linear regression in the playoffs to figure out how far they're going to make it. The reason for this is in the regular season, your really biggest goal is just whether or not you make your playoffs. That's just a binary outcome, and so I'm using logistic regression for that. But once you've made the playoffs, I'll be using linear regression because then I want to see from that point how many playoff games you get, how many times can you dip that playoff revenue. And you might have noticed that a lot of my regression models are based on the percentages of team spending, not just their total spending, but like the percentage of the amount that you spend allocated to each position and things like that. That is to control for the known effects that you can see in the graphic here, that there's obviously a relationship between the total money spent in points one, and so I'm trying to control for that, and so it's not just you should spend more on everybody because teams who spend more win more. And so just to summarize, when making the playoffs, teams can make about $5 million per home game from things like ticket sales, concessions, things like that. And so when you consider the fact that teams in the playoffs play about 5.5 games on average, that's over $27 million of potential revenue every time you make the playoffs. So this can be a pretty big deal. And so for this project, I will basically be using the NHL salary data from the last 4 seasons to try and figure out the optimal strategies to maximize that number of $5 million bonuses you get. Thank you for your time.